The Moonlight Massacre. The town of Darkwilds was a peaceful place, nestled in the heart of the forest. But on the night of the full moon, something changed. The townspeople heard howling in the distance, and they knew that the werewolf had returned. The werewolf had been terrorizing the town for years, killing anyone who crossed its path. But tonight, the creature was more vicious than ever. It attacked without warning, tearing apart anyone who dared to venture out into the moonlit streets. As the night wore on, the death toll rose. The townspeople were paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. They had tried everything to stop the werewolf in the past, but nothing had worked. The creature was too powerful, too cunning. But then, a young woman named Sarah had an idea. She had read about a powerful spell that could banish the werewolf back to the spirit realm. The spell was dangerous and unpredictable, but Sarah knew it was their only hope. With the help of a few other brave townspeople, Sarah set out to find the ingredients for the spell. They traveled deep into the forest, searching for rare herbs and potions. They had to be careful not to attract the werewolf's attention, as it could spell their doom. As they gathered the ingredients, the howling grew louder and more frequent. The werewolf was getting closer, and they had to hurry. Finally, they had everything they needed, and they headed back to town. The streets were eerily quiet, and the air was thick with tension. They knew the werewolf was still out there, waiting for them. But Sarah and her companions were determined to banish the creature once and for all. They gathered in the town square, under the light of the full moon. Sarah began the incantation, her voice rising in a powerful chant. The other townspeople joined in, their voices adding to the magic. Suddenly, the air began to shimmer, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The werewolf emerged from the shadows, snarling and drooling. It charged at them, but Sarah continued the incantation, her voice growing louder and more powerful. The werewolf slowed down, and its eyes grew wide with fear. It realized too late what was happening. The spell was working, and it was being banished back to the spirit realm. The creature let out a final howl before disappearing in a burst of energy. The town was quiet once again, and the air was thick with relief. The townspeople knew that they were safe, at least for now. But as they began to celebrate their victory, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They turned to see a pack of wolves emerging from the forest. The wolves were different than any they had seen before. Their eyes glowed red in the moonlight, and their teeth were razor-sharp. The townspeople realized with horror that they had banished the werewolf, but they had unleashed something far worse. The pack of wolves charged at them, their jaws snapping. The townspeople fought back, but it was no use. The wolves were too powerful, too numerous. The town was plunged into chaos and carnage as the Moonlight Massacre claimed countless lives. Sarah and a few others managed to escape, but they knew that the pack of wolves would continue to hunt them. They were doomed to live out the rest of their lives in fear, always looking over their shoulders for the next full moon and the next attack. The Curse of the Blood Moon. A small town known for its peaceful and quiet surroundings. However, every full moon, the town became a place of terror and fear. A werewolf prowled the streets, killing anyone who crossed its path. No one knew who the creature was or how to stop it, but the legend said that if the werewolf was killed during the blood moon, the curse would be lifted. On the night of the blood moon, a group of teenagers decided to take matters into their own hands. They had heard the legend and believed that they could end the curse once and for all. Armed with silver bullets and torches, they set out to hunt the beast. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the town as the teenagers made their way through the dark streets. Suddenly, they heard a growl, followed by a low howl. The werewolf was near. They followed the sound to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. As they approached, they saw the beast standing on its hind legs, ready to pounce. The teenagers opened fire, their silver bullets hitting the creature's chest. The werewolf howled in pain, but it didn't go down. Instead, it charged at them, its massive claws extended. The teenagers scattered, trying to avoid the beast's attack. One of them, a girl named Emily, tripped and fell, the werewolf closing in on her. Just as it was about to strike, a figure appeared out of nowhere, wielding a silver-tipped spear. It was an old man, the last surviving member of a family that had been cursed by the werewolf centuries ago. The old man fought the werewolf with all his might, his spear piercing the creature's heart. The werewolf let out a final howl before collapsing on the ground, its curse finally lifted. The teenagers cheered, relieved that the curse was over. But as they turned to leave, they heard a low growl. They looked back and saw that the old man had been bitten by the werewolf. The curse had been passed on to him. The old man looked at the teenagers and said, "I'm sorry. The curse can only be lifted by someone who is not already cursed. I had to do what I could to end it, but now it's up to you. You must find a way to end the curse once and for all." The teenagers nodded, realizing that they had just inherited a curse that had plagued their town for generations. As they walked away, they could hear the old man's screams, his transformation into a werewolf beginning. The curse had not been lifted. It had only been passed on. And the teenagers knew that they would have to fight the curse every full moon, or risk becoming monsters themselves. The Werewolf's Lair. It was a warm summer evening when John and Sarah decided to go hiking in the woods. They had been dating for a few months and wanted to spend some time alone, surrounded by nature. They packed a few essentials and headed out, looking forward to a peaceful and relaxing hike. As they walked deeper into the woods, they came across an old cabin. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and a rusted door. John and Sarah were curious, and being the adventurous types, decided to take a closer look. They pushed the door open, and the hinges squeaked loudly. Inside, it was dark and musty, with cobwebs and dust covering every surface. As they walked through the cabin, they heard a low growl coming from the back of the room. John and Sarah froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. They didn't know what to do, but they knew they had to leave the cabin as soon as possible. As they turned to leave, they heard the growling again, and this time it was louder. They saw a shadow moving in the darkness, and they knew they were not alone. Suddenly, a werewolf appeared in front of them, snarling and drooling. John and Sarah screamed, but they were frozen in fear. The werewolf was massive, with sharp claws and teeth that glinted in the moonlight. The werewolf lunged at them, and John and Sarah tried to fight it off with their hiking poles. But the creature was too strong, and it knocked them both to the ground. They knew they were going to die, but they refused to give up without a fight. Just as the werewolf was about to deliver the final blow, a gunshot rang out, and the creature fell to the ground, dead. A group of hunters had been tracking the werewolf for weeks, and they had finally found its lair. John and Sarah were safe, but they were traumatized by the experience. They knew that they were lucky to be alive, and they vowed never to go hiking in the woods again. As they walked away from the cabin, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They turned to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at them. They knew that the werewolf's pack was still out there, and they were not safe. The tension in the air was palpable as they hurried back to their car, looking over their shoulders the whole way. They knew that the werewolf's lair was just the beginning, and that their nightmare was far from over. The Howling. It was a peaceful night in the small town of Telton, or so it seemed. The moon was full and bright in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the town. But then, a howl shattered the silence, and another followed. The townspeople knew what that meant. The werewolf was back. The town had been plagued by the werewolf for years, but no one knew who or what it was. Every full moon, the creature would emerge from the woods and terrorize the town, killing anyone who crossed its path. The townspeople had tried everything to stop the werewolf, but nothing worked. They had even brought in hunters from neighboring towns, but they had been unsuccessful in their attempts to catch the beast. The werewolf was too smart and too fast, always staying one step ahead of them. As the howling grew louder and more frequent, the townspeople grew more afraid. They knew that they were running out of time, and that they had to do something before the werewolf struck again. One night, a group of townspeople decided to take matters into their own hands. Armed with silver weapons and torches, they set out into the woods, determined to catch the werewolf once and for all. The woods were dark and quiet, but the group could sense that they were being watched. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the werewolf, snarling and drooling, its eyes glowing in the dark. The group opened fire, their silver bullets hitting the creature's chest. The werewolf howled in pain, but it didn't go down. Instead, it charged at them, its massive claws extended. The group scattered, trying to avoid the beast's attack. But one of them, a man named Tom, wasn't fast enough. The werewolf grabbed him, its jaws clamping down on his throat. Tom screamed in agony, but it was too late. The werewolf had claimed its victim. The group continued to fight, their torches illuminating the dark woods. But the werewolf was too strong, too fast. It seemed to be invincible, unstoppable. Just as the group was about to give up, a woman named Emily remembered a legend she had heard as a child. The legend said that if the werewolf was killed with a wooden stake through the heart during the blood moon, the curse would be lifted. Emily shared the legend with the group, and they knew they had to try it. They fashioned a wooden stake from a nearby tree and aimed for the werewolf's heart. It was a risky move, but they had nothing left to lose. The werewolf charged at them one final time, but this time, the group was ready. They drove the wooden stake through the creature's heart, and it let out a final howl before collapsing to the ground, dead. The townspeople cheered, relieved that the curse was over. But as they turned to leave, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They looked back and saw that the werewolf's pack was watching them, waiting for revenge. The tension in the air was palpable as the group hurried back to town, looking over their shoulders the whole way. They knew that the werewolf's curse was lifted, but the danger was far from over. The werewolf's pack was still out there, and they were coming for them. The werewolf's curse. For generations, the small town of Millfield had been plagued by a curse. Every full moon, a werewolf would stalk the streets, tearing apart anyone who crossed its path. The townspeople had tried everything to break the curse, but nothing had worked. They had accepted their fate, living in fear of the werewolf's wrath. But one young woman named Emily was determined to end the curse once and for all. She had always been fascinated by the supernatural and had spent years studying the lore of werewolves. She believed that she had found a way to lift the curse, and she was willing to do whatever it took to succeed. Emily had discovered a rare herb that was said to have the power to break any curse. She had to travel deep into the forest to find it, but she was determined to succeed. She knew that the herb would only be effective if she could get the werewolf to ingest it directly, so she hatched a plan. On the night of the full moon, Emily ventured out into the town square where the werewolf was known to appear. She carried a small vial of the herb hidden in her pocket. She waited patiently, her heart racing as she listened for the sound of howling. As the moon rose higher in the sky, Emily heard the sound she had been waiting for. The werewolf emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing yellow in the moonlight. Emily stood her ground, watching as the creature approached. But then, something strange happened. The werewolf stopped in its tracks, staring at Emily with a look of recognition. Emily was shocked. She had never seen the werewolf act like this before. But then, she realized what was happening. The werewolf was someone she knew. Emily's heart sank as she recognized the familiar face of the local sheriff. She had always thought he was a little odd, but she never would have guessed that he was the werewolf. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. But Emily didn't have time to process her shock. The werewolf charged at her, its jaws snapping. Emily quickly pulled out the vial of herb and held it out in front of her. The werewolf hesitated for a moment and then lunged forward. Emily managed to pour the herb into the werewolf's mouth, and she watched as the creature convulsed and thrashed about. She could hear bones breaking, and she knew that the curse was being lifted. The werewolf fell to the ground, its body contorted and twisted. Emily approached cautiously, watching as the werewolf began to transform back into its human form. The sheriff lay on the ground, gasping for air. Emily knelt down beside him, trying to help. But then, something strange happened. The sheriff's eyes flickered open, and he grinned wickedly at Emily. She realized with horror that the curse had not been lifted after all. The werewolf had simply taken on a new form. The sheriff lunged at Emily, his jaws snapping. She tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. She knew that she was going to die. But then, something strange happened. Emily felt a surge of power coursing through her body. She felt the curse passing from the werewolf to herself. She realized that she had become the new werewolf. The sheriff lay motionless on the ground, and Emily stood up, her body racked with pain. She knew that she was now the one who would terrorize the town on the next full moon. She had become the werewolf's curse. As Emily stumbled away from the town square, she could hear the screams of the townspeople ringing in her ears. She knew that she would never be able to control. The Hunted. It was a cold, autumn night in the small town of Ravensshire. A group of hunters had gathered in a local tavern, swapping stories and sipping on beer. They were all seasoned hunters, and they prided themselves on their ability to track down any prey. But tonight, they were in for a surprise. As they left the tavern, they heard a howling in the distance. It was a sound they had heard many times before, but this time it seemed different. The howling was closer and more urgent. The hunters began to make their way towards the source of the sound, their rifles at the ready. They had heard rumors of a werewolf in the area, and they were eager to add it to their trophy collection. As they moved deeper into the woods, the howling grew louder. The hunters were on high alert, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But then they heard something else. It was a whimpering sound coming from just ahead of them. The hunters cautiously approached, and what they found shocked them to their core. There, huddled on the ground, was a young woman. She was bleeding from a deep gash on her leg, and she was trembling with fear. The hunters realized with horror that she was the werewolf they had been tracking. The young woman pleaded with the hunters, telling them that she had been cursed by a powerful witch. She had no control over her transformation, and she had been hiding in the woods for fear of hurting anyone. The hunters were skeptical, but they could see the fear in the woman's eyes. They decided to take her back to town, hoping to find a solution to the curse. But as they made their way back, they realized that they were being followed. They heard the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves, and they knew that the werewolf was still on their trail. The hunters quickened their pace, but it was too late. The werewolf emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a fierce hunger. The hunters tried to fight it off, but they were no match for its strength. One by one, the hunters fell to the werewolf's vicious attacks. The young woman, who had been saved by the hunters only moments before, watched in horror as her curse claimed yet another victim. As the last hunter fell to the ground, the young woman realized that there was no escaping her curse. She was doomed to live the rest of her life as a monster, hunted by those who sought to destroy her. The young woman turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. She knew that she would never be safe, that she would always be hunted by those who saw her as nothing more than a monster. As she disappeared into the night, the young woman could hear the sound of footsteps following her. She knew that she would never be able to outrun this fate that awaits. The Werewolf's Revenge. The small village in England had been plagued by a series of gruesome murders. The locals whispered that it was the work of a werewolf, and they were terrified. The authorities had been called in, but they seemed powerless to stop the killer. One night, a group of hunters arrived in Birchwood. They claimed to be experts in hunting werewolves, and they were determined to track down the killer. The villagers were skeptical, but they were desperate for a solution. The hunters set up camp outside of the village, and they spent several days preparing their gear. They had silver bullets, wolfsbane, and other tools of the trade. They were confident that they would be able to catch the werewolf. As the night of the full moon approached, the hunters set out into the forest. They followed the trail of the werewolf, using their keen senses to track it down. The night was dark and foggy, and the hunters knew that they were in for a dangerous hunt. As they closed in on the werewolf's lair, they saw a figure moving in the shadows. They raised their weapons, ready to attack. But then, they realized that it was not a werewolf at all. It was a young woman, dressed in ragged clothes. She was covered in dirt and blood, and she looked terrified. The hunters were confused. They had been expecting to find a monster, not a human. The woman stumbled towards them, pleading for their help. She told them that she had been attacked by the werewolf, and that she was now infected with the curse. The hunters were skeptical, but they couldn't deny the evidence of their own eyes. They decided to take the woman back to their camp, where they could study her condition. They had never encountered a werewolf who could speak or reason like a human before. They were fascinated and repelled at the same time. As they examined the woman, they realized that she was not like any werewolf they had ever seen. She was able to control her transformations, and she seemed to have some degree of intelligence. They realized that she could be a valuable asset to their hunting team. But then, something strange happened. The hunters began to feel the curse taking hold of them as well. They realized with horror that the woman had infected them. They had become the hunted. As the full moon rose higher in the sky, the hunters felt their bodies transforming. They knew that they were now the ones who would terrorize the village. They had become the very thing they had set out to destroy. The woman watched with a look of satisfaction as the hunters transformed. She had lured them into a trap, using her cunning and her control over the curse. She knew that they would be no match for her. As the hunters stumbled into the village, they were met with a hail of silver bullets. The villagers had armed themselves, determined to defend their homes from the werewolf. The hunters fell one by one, their bodies racked with pain. The woman watched from the shadows, knowing that she had succeeded in her mission. She had not only escaped the hunters, but she had also taken revenge on the village that had shunned her. She vanished into the night, leaving the hunters and the villagers to deal with the aftermath of the hunt. As the sun rose over Birchwood, the villagers looked out at the devastation that the hunters and the werewolf had wrought. They knew that they would never be safe again as long as the curse of the werewolf remained. The Howling Woods. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip, just a group of friends venturing into the deep woods for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and stargazing. But as they set up camp, something felt off. The woods were eerily silent, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. As night fell, the friends sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. But their laughter was cut short by the sound of something moving around their campsite. "What was that?" whispered Emily, clutching her blanket tighter. "Probably just a raccoon or something," replied Tom, trying to sound brave. But they all knew it wasn't just a raccoon. They could hear the heavy footsteps, the rustling of leaves, and the eerie howling that seemed to be coming from all directions. Suddenly, a shadowy figure darted across their field of vision, and they all jumped back in fear. "What was that?" screamed Sarah, her eyes wide with terror. "It's probably just a stray dog," said Jake, trying to keep his cool. But they all knew it wasn't a dog. It was something much more sinister. As they huddled together, the group heard the sound of more footsteps approaching. This time, they were louder and more menacing. Then, out of the darkness, emerged a pack of werewolves. Their eyes glinted in the firelight, and their razor-sharp teeth glistened in the moonlight. The friends scrambled to their feet, but it was too late. The werewolves had surrounded them, blocking their path to safety. With no cell service and no way to call for help, the friends had no choice but to fight for their lives. They grabbed whatever they could find, sticks, rocks, even the cooking utensils, and prepared to face the creatures of the night. The battle was fierce and bloody. The friends were outnumbered and outmatched, but they fought with all their might. Emily was the first to fall, her throat ripped open by one of the werewolves. Then Tom, Jake, and Sarah went down, one by one. In the end, only one person survived, a young woman named Lily. She had managed to grab a hunting knife from her backpack, and she used it to fend off the werewolves. But as the adrenaline wore off, she realized that she was alone in the woods, surrounded by the bodies of her friends. Lily stumbled through the woods, her heart pounding with fear. She had no idea how she was going to make it out alive. But as she stumbled upon a ranger station, she felt a glimmer of hope. She burst through the door, gasping for breath, and told the rangers what had happened. But they didn't believe her. They thought she was just another crazy camper with a wild imagination. But Lily knew the truth. She knew that the Howling Woods were not safe for anyone. And she knew that she would never forget the terror that had befallen her and her friends that night. Blood Red Moon. As the full moon rose above the horizon, casting an eerie red glow over the forest, a group of teenagers set out on a late-night hike. They had heard stories of strange creatures lurking in the woods on nights like this, but they brushed them off as nothing more than local legends. The group consisted of 4 friends: Amy, Tyler, Lauren, and Josh. They were all thrill seekers, always looking for the next adventure. As they made their way deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to loom over them, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Suddenly, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They stopped in their tracks, listening intently. But when nothing emerged from the undergrowth, they shrugged it off and continued on their way. As they walked, the moon seemed to grow brighter, casting longer and darker shadows across their path. Amy's heart raced with excitement and a touch of fear. Suddenly, they saw movement up ahead. At first, they thought it was a deer, but as it stepped into the light, they saw that it was something much more sinister. It was a werewolf. The creature's eyes glinted in the moonlight, and its fur bristled as it prepared to pounce. The teenagers tried to run, but the werewolf was too fast. It caught up to them in a matter of seconds, its claws tearing at their flesh. The group fought back with everything they had, but the werewolf was too strong. One by one, they fell to the ground, their screams echoing through the forest. As the last of the group fell, the werewolf let out a blood-curdling howl. The sound seemed to reverberate through the trees, carrying far beyond the forest. The next morning, a search party was sent out to find the missing teenagers. When they reached the spot where they had last been seen, they found nothing but a pool of blood and shreds of torn clothing. No trace of the werewolf was ever found, but the locals knew that it was still out there, waiting for the next full moon to unleash its fury on the unsuspecting. And every time the blood moon rose above the horizon, the people of the town would lock their doors and shutter their windows, afraid of what might lurk in the darkness beyond. The Beast Within. Mark had always felt like something was off about himself, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But he had always brushed it off as just being his overactive imagination. It wasn't until he moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere that things started to get weird. Every full moon, Mark would feel an intense urge to run through the woods, howling at the moon like a wild animal. At first, he thought it was just his body adjusting to the new environment, but as the months went on, he began to suspect that there was something more to it. Something dark and sinister lurking beneath the surface. One night, as the full moon rose above the horizon, Mark felt the familiar tingle in his bones. He knew what he had to do. He slipped out of his house, ignoring the protests of his roommate, and made his way into the woods. As he ran through the trees, his senses heightened, and he could feel his body changing. His skin itched, and his muscles grew stronger. He was no longer human. Mark was a werewolf. As he howled at the moon, Mark felt a sense of freedom he had never experienced before. It was like he was finally being true to himself, letting the beast within take over. But as the night wore on, Mark began to feel a sense of dread. He knew that if he didn't get back to his house before the sun rose, he would be stuck in his werewolf form forever. He raced through the woods, his heart pounding with fear. The forest seemed to grow darker, and the trees seemed to reach out and grab at him, trying to keep him from escaping. Finally, he burst out of the woods and into the open field. But as he looked up, he saw the sun beginning to rise over the horizon. Mark screamed in terror as he felt his body start to change again. His bones cracked and shifted, and his fur receded, leaving him naked and vulnerable in the morning light. He stumbled back to his house, his body aching with exhaustion. He collapsed on his bed, his mind reeling from the experience. As Mark lay there, he realized that he could never go back to the way things were before. He was no longer just Mark, he was something else entirely. Something dangerous and unpredictable. From that day forward, Mark never ventured out into the woods on the night of the full moon. But he could still feel the beast within him, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to take over once again. Moonlight Madness. It was the night of the full moon, and the town was alive with rumors of a werewolf on the loose. Most people laughed it off as an urban legend, but deep down, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was not quite right. Among the townspeople was a young woman named Emily. She had always been fascinated by the supernatural and had spent countless hours reading books about werewolves and other creatures of the night. As the night wore on, Emily found herself drawn to the woods outside of town. She had heard stories of a clearing where the werewolf was said to roam, and she was determined to see it for herself. She made her way through the forest, her heart racing with excitement and fear. The moon was full and bright, casting an eerie glow over the trees. As she approached the clearing, Emily heard a low growl. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Was it the werewolf? Suddenly, a large creature leapt out of the shadows, knocking her to the ground. Emily screamed as she felt the creature's hot breath on her neck. But as she looked up, she saw that it wasn't a werewolf after all. It was just a large dog. Emily breathed a sigh of relief and began to pet the dog, calming it down. But as she looked into its eyes, she saw something strange. It was like the dog was trying to tell her something. Without warning, the dog took off into the woods, its tail wagging excitedly. Emily knew that she had to follow it, even if it meant risking her life. She chased the dog through the forest, following it deeper and deeper into the woods. The moonlight seemed to grow brighter, casting longer and darker shadows across her path. Suddenly, the dog stopped in its tracks, its ears perked up. Emily looked around, trying to see what had caught its attention. And then she saw it. The werewolf. It was massive, towering over her like a giant. Its eyes glowed in the moonlight, and its fur bristled as it prepared to attack. Emily ran as fast as she could, but the werewolf was too fast. It caught up to her in a matter of seconds, its claws tearing at her flesh. She fought back with everything she had, but the werewolf was too strong. Emily knew that she was going to die. But just as the werewolf was about to deliver the killing blow, the large dog leapt out of the bushes and attacked it. The werewolf and the dog fought fiercely, their growls echoing through the forest. Emily watched in horror, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, the werewolf retreated, limping off into the woods. The dog turned to Emily, its tail wagging happily. As Emily stumbled back to her house, she knew that she would never forget the terror she had experienced that night. And every time the full moon rose above the horizon, she would remember the werewolf and the dog, locked in a never-ending battle between good and evil. The Curse of the Wolf. It was a cold, dark night when Peter arrived at the old mansion on the outskirts of town. He had been hired as the new caretaker, tasked with looking after the property while the owners were away. As he made his way through the large, creaky doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was not quite right. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to whisper ancient secrets that he couldn't quite make out. Peter was a superstitious man, and he had heard stories about the mansion being cursed. It was said that anyone who stayed there too long would be haunted by the spirits of the past, or worse yet, fall victim to the curse of the wolf. He tried to shrug off the feeling and went about his duties, cleaning and tidying up the mansion. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Doors creaked open on their own, and shadows seemed to dance across the walls. Peter began to feel uneasy, but he pushed on, determined to prove to himself that there was nothing to be afraid of. But then he heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the mansion. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before, and it sent shivers down his spine. He crept through the dark, musty halls, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at him from the darkness. Peter tried to run, but he was too late. The creature pounced on him, knocking him to the ground. He fought back with everything he had, but it was no use. As the creature ripped into his flesh, Peter realized the truth. The mansion was indeed cursed, and he was the latest victim of the curse of the wolf. But just as he was about to take his last breath, Peter heard a sound that gave him hope. It was the sound of the mansion's owners returning home. They burst into the mansion, guns drawn, and the creature turned to face them. They fired a barrage of shots, and the creature fell to the ground, motionless. As they rushed over to Peter, they realized that it was too late. The curse of the wolf had claimed another victim. From that day on, the mansion was left abandoned, a reminder of the curse that lurked within its walls. And whenever anyone passed by, they couldn't help but feel a shiver run down their spine, wondering if they too would fall prey to the curse of the wolf. The Werewolf Hunter. Jack had been hunting werewolves for as long as he could remember. He was one of the few who knew of their existence, and he had dedicated his life to tracking them down and putting an end to their reign of terror. One night, Jack received a call from a small town on the outskirts of the forest. The townspeople were terrified, as they believed that a werewolf was on the loose, attacking and killing anyone who dared to venture into the woods. Jack packed his bags and headed for the town, eager to take on the challenge. He arrived in the evening and immediately set out into the forest, determined to find the werewolf before it could claim another victim. For hours he searched, following the sounds of growling and the smell of wet fur. But the werewolf was elusive, and Jack was getting frustrated. Just as he was about to give up and head back to town, he heard a twig snap behind him. He spun around, his silver-tipped arrow at the ready. And there it was. The werewolf, staring him down with glowing yellow eyes. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired his arrow, hitting the werewolf right in the heart. The werewolf howled in pain and collapsed to the ground. Jack rushed over, ready to finish the job. But as he got closer, he realized that something was wrong. The werewolf was changing back into human form. And not just any human, it was the town's sheriff. Jack was stunned. He had never encountered a werewolf who could control their transformations like this. The sheriff looked up at him with tears in his eyes. "I didn't want to do it," he said. "I couldn't control it. It's a curse, you see. A curse that's been passed down through my family for generations." Jack was torn. He had never killed a human before, let alone someone he had once considered an ally. But he knew what he had to do. He fired his arrow, putting an end to the sheriff's suffering. As he made his way back to town, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The thought that there could be more werewolves out there, living among humans, was a terrifying one. And as he settled into his hotel room for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He sat up in bed, his silver-tipped arrow at the ready, and waited for the sun to rise. The Midnight Howler. For as long as anyone in the small town of Millfield could remember, there had been rumors of a werewolf lurking in the woods outside of town. But no one had ever seen it, and many dismissed it as nothing more than a tall tale. That is, until the night of the full moon when the howling began. It was unlike any sound the townspeople had ever heard, a guttural, unearthly noise that echoed through the streets and sent chills down their spines. The howling continued every full moon, always at the stroke of midnight. No one ever saw the werewolf, but they all knew it was out there, waiting for its next victim. Emily was a young woman who had just moved to Millfield to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. She had always been fascinated by the supernatural, and the stories of the werewolf intrigued her. One night, as the full moon rose high in the sky, Emily decided to go for a walk in the woods. She was curious and a little bit daring, and she wanted to see if she could find any evidence of the werewolf. As she walked deeper into the woods, the howling grew louder. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, but she pushed on, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Suddenly, she heard rustling in the bushes. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. And then, out of the shadows, emerged the werewolf. It was massive, with dark fur and glowing yellow eyes. Emily tried to run, but it was too fast. It tackled her to the ground, its claws digging into her flesh. But just as Emily thought she was done for, the werewolf recoiled, howling in pain. Emily looked up and saw a figure emerge from the trees. It was the town's reclusive old man, who had always been rumored to know more about the werewolf than he let on. The old man had a silver-tipped arrow in his hand, and he fired it straight at the werewolf's heart. The werewolf howled one final time before collapsing to the ground, its form slowly changing back into that of a man. Emily looked up at the old man, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. The old man simply nodded. "I've been tracking that werewolf for years," he said. "But I never thought it would go after someone like you. You're lucky I was here." Emily nodded, grateful but still shaken. She couldn't shake the feeling that the werewolf wasn't the only danger lurking in the woods. As she walked back to town, she couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden in the darkness. Howling in the bush. The quaint town of Densington had always been a peaceful place, but for the past few months, a strange howling noise had been heard every night. At first, people thought it was just a pack of wild dogs, but as the howling continued, rumors began to spread that a werewolf was on the loose. Most people didn't believe the stories, but there were a few who took them seriously. One night, a group of teenagers decided to investigate the howling. They armed themselves with flashlights, sticks, and a camera to document any evidence they might find. As they ventured into the woods, the howling grew louder and more intense. They followed the sound until they came across a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood a large, black werewolf with piercing yellow eyes. The teenagers froze in terror as the werewolf began to approach them. One of the boys tried to take a picture, but his camera malfunctioned. The werewolf lunged at the group, and they scattered in all directions. They ran blindly through the woods, tripping over roots and branches in their panicked state. The werewolf continued to chase them, its howls echoing through the night. Eventually, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin and barricaded themselves inside. For hours, they waited, huddled together in fear. The howling outside continued, but they couldn't see the werewolf through the boarded-up windows. As the night wore on, they began to hear scratching at the door and windows. Suddenly, there was silence. The scratching had stopped. They cautiously peeked through a crack in the boards and saw that the werewolf was gone. They waited a few more minutes before cautiously stepping outside. The woods were quiet now, and the howling had stopped. They walked back to town, shaken but relieved to be alive. They never spoke of the incident again, but the memory of the terrifying werewolf remained with them for the rest of their lives. The Curse of the Silver Amulet. Erie town was known for its long history of supernatural occurrences. For generations, the townspeople had passed down stories of witches, ghosts, and werewolves that had roamed the area. One of the most persistent legends was that of the Silver Amulet, a powerful talisman said to protect the wearer from the curse of the werewolf. The amulet had been passed down through the generations of one family, the Carmichaels, who were said to have been cursed with lycanthropy for centuries. The family was feared and avoided by the other townspeople, who believed that they were responsible for the mysterious disappearances and strange occurrences that happened in Ravenwood. One day, a young girl named Lily Carmichael inherited the silver amulet from her grandmother. Lily was warned by her family that the amulet was powerful but also carried a curse that could be passed down to her. At first, Lily didn't believe in the curse or the stories of werewolves. But soon, she began to experience strange dreams and heard howling at night. The more she wore the amulet, the more she felt as though she was being watched. One full moon night, Lily decided to test the power of the amulet. She went out into the woods, where she knew that the werewolves were said to roam, wearing the amulet around her neck. But when she returned home, she found that the amulet had disappeared. Lily began to panic. She knew that if the amulet fell into the wrong hands, it could be disastrous for the town of Ravenwood. She set out to find it, using her knowledge of the town and its legends to guide her. As she searched, she was pursued by a strange figure in the shadows, a creature with eyes that glowed in the dark. She realized that she was being hunted by a werewolf, and that the curse had been passed down to her. Finally, she found the amulet in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. But as she reached for it, the werewolf attacked. In the struggle, Lily realized that she had the strength and agility of a werewolf. She fought back fiercely, using her newfound powers to defeat the creature. Lily returned home, the silver amulet around her neck once again. She knew that she could never remove it, for the curse was now a part of her. But she also knew that with the amulet and her newfound powers, she could protect the town of Ravenwood from the darkness that lurked within it. The Wolf Among Us. In the small town of Willow Creek, strange occurrences had been happening for weeks. People reported sightings of a large wolf-like creature prowling the streets at night, and several pets had gone missing without a trace. One night, local detective Sam Williams was called to investigate a break-in at a nearby store. When he arrived, he found the store's owner cowering in a corner, trembling with fear. She told him that she had seen the wolf-like creature outside her store, and that it had broken in and stolen a valuable item, a strange silver amulet. Sam knew that he had to act fast. He had heard the rumors of a werewolf in town, but he had never believed them until now. He gathered his equipment and set out into the night to track down the creature. As he roamed the streets, he began to sense that he was being watched. Suddenly, the werewolf leaped out from the shadows, attacking him with savage ferocity. Sam fought back, using his training and expertise to hold his own against the creature. But as the fight wore on, Sam realized that something was different about this werewolf. It seemed more intelligent than any animal he had ever encountered, and it moved with a fluid grace that was almost human-like. Finally, Sam managed to subdue the creature, trapping it in a cage. As he studied the werewolf more closely, he realized that there was something familiar about it. He could almost sense a human intelligence behind the creature's eyes. Then, to his shock, the werewolf spoke to him. It revealed that it was not a true werewolf, but a human who had been cursed with the ability to transform into a wolf. The amulet that had been stolen was the only thing that could break the curse, and the creature had been desperate to get it back. Sam realized that he had a choice to make. He could turn the creature over to the authorities, or he could help it break the curse and find a way to return to its human form. In the end, Sam chose to help the creature. Together, they set out to find the missing amulet and break the curse. They faced many challenges along the way, but eventually they succeeded. The curse was broken, and the creature transformed back into a human. It was a young woman named Maya, who had been cursed by a jealous rival. Sam helped Maya adjust to her newfound freedom, and they became close friends. The wolf among them had been tamed, and Sam knew that he had helped to bring a little bit of justice and peace to the troubled town of Willow Creek. The Full Moon Curse. For as long as he could remember, Jacob had always been fascinated with werewolves. He loved the idea of the savage beast lurking just beneath the surface of a human being, waiting to be unleashed under the light of the full moon. But one day, Jacob's fascination turned into a nightmare. He began to notice strange changes in himself. His senses became sharper, his body stronger and more agile. And every full moon, he felt an intense craving for raw meat and a wild, uncontrollable rage that he could not explain. Jacob soon realized that he had become a werewolf himself, cursed with the same affliction that had captivated him for so long. At first, he was horrified by the thought, but as time went on, he began to revel in the power and freedom that the curse gave him. But with that power came a terrible cost. Every time he transformed into his werewolf form, he lost a little bit more of his humanity. He began to enjoy the thrill of the hunt, and he took pleasure in the pain and suffering of his prey. Jacob knew that he had to find a way to break the curse before it was too late. He consulted with experts and searched through ancient texts, but nothing seemed to work. He was trapped in his cursed state with no hope of escape. As the months wore on, Jacob began to lose hope. He felt himself slipping further and further away from his humanity, and he knew that soon there would be nothing left of him but a savage beast. But then, one day, he met a woman named Anna. She was a hunter, like Jacob, but unlike him, she had dedicated her life to protecting people from the creatures of the night. At first, Jacob was wary of Anna. He had never trusted hunters, seeing them as his mortal enemies. But as they worked together to hunt down a particularly dangerous werewolf, Jacob began to see Anna in a different light. He realized that she was not the heartless monster that he had imagined, but a person with her own fears and doubts. And he saw in her the potential for something that he had thought was lost forever: humanity. Together, Jacob and Anna began a quest to break the curse. They faced many challenges and dangers along the way, but their determination never wavered. In the end, they found a way to break the curse. It was a dangerous and painful process, but Jacob was willing to face any amount of pain if it meant regaining his humanity. And so, Jacob was transformed back into a human. He was free from the curse that had haunted him for so long, and he was filled with a newfound appreciation for the precious gift of humanity. He knew that he would never forget the lessons he had learned during his time as a werewolf: the power and the savagery of the curse, the thrill of the hunt, and the importance of never losing sight of one's humanity. The family curse. In a small town nestled deep in the forest, there lived a family who had been cursed for generations. The curse was said to have been placed on the family by a group of angry witches who had been wronged by one of their ancestors. The curse was simple yet devastating. Every member of the family, once they reached the age of 18, would transform into a werewolf on the night of the full moon. They would lose all control and become savage beasts, unable to remember anything they did during their transformation. Despite the curse, the family had managed to live relatively normal lives, keeping their secret hidden from the rest of the town. But everything changed when the youngest member of the family, a boy named Lucas, turned 18. Lucas had grown up hearing stories about the curse, but he never truly believed them. He had always assumed it was just a silly superstition, a story to scare children. But on the night of his 18th birthday, Lucas learned the truth. As the moon rose high in the sky, Lucas felt a strange sensation coursing through his body. His muscles began to ache, and his senses became heightened. He knew what was happening. The curse had finally caught up to him. Lucas tried to fight the transformation, but it was no use. As the full moon cast its eerie light over the forest, he felt his body changing. His bones cracked and twisted, and fur sprouted from his skin. In moments, Lucas was transformed into a snarling, ferocious beast, driven by primal instincts. He ran through the forest, hunting and killing any prey he could find. But when the sun rose the next morning, Lucas was shocked to find himself back in his human form. He had no memory of what had happened during the night, but he knew that something terrible had taken place. Over the next few months, Lucas struggled to come to terms with his curse. He began to isolate himself from his family and friends, afraid of what he might do during his transformations. But eventually, Lucas realized that he couldn't hide from his curse forever. He decided to face it head-on, seeking out any knowledge he could find about werewolves and their transformations. As he delved deeper into his research, Lucas discovered a way to control his transformations. By focusing on his emotions and mental state, he could maintain control over his wolf form and even retain his memories from the night before. With this newfound knowledge, Lucas began to live his life again, free from the fear of his curse. He became a powerful force for good in his community, using his werewolf abilities to protect those in need and fight against evil. The curse that had plagued his family for generations was finally broken, thanks to Lucas' determination and courage. He had not only overcome his curse, but had also embraced it, using it to become a hero and inspire others to face their own fears.